on terrorist funding, countering transnational threats. I am Dr. Michelle Frazier. I am Director of Global Content at LexisNexis Risk Solutions. And today I'm joined by Andrew Mackay, who has extensive experience in military intelligence and has spoken and dealt with a host of topics. But today we're going to talk about one of his specialties, which is financial crime, specifically threats, financial threats. So threat and looking at threat finance and how we can counter that with intelligence. Welcome, Andy.
Good morning, Michelle. Thanks for hosting me with LexisNexis. It's good to be here.
Absolutely. Glad to have you. So I think next we'll just give an overview to everyone about what the agenda is and our aims. The aim is to explain how intelligence techniques can help financial institutions with their compliance. And this is very important in how to analyze data and how to look at data, how to collect data, which of course is the aim of the AML-CTF regime. First off, we're going to start with some definitions, just give us some basis and make sure everyone's on the same page to know what we're talking about on money laundering and terrorist finances, definitions and differences, some similarities. Then we're going to talk about the financial crime landscape. How do these networks actually work? How do they operate? What do we know, and how can we use that? And that goes into actually countering the threat. This is a very important word here, threat. We've been using it. We will be using it throughout the webinar, trying to show how financial institutions should really look at the threats themselves when they're screening, not just the market or the regulatory risk. Then we're going to go on and talk about some intelligence techniques. How do we use these processes to better analyze data and to find the people that we're looking for, the transactions that we're looking for. And then along the way, we'll be showing examples of how intelligence can improve all of these processes. So some definitions. Money laundering and terrorism. So money laundering, most people here are absolutely familiar with this. This is the concealment or disguising of where vast amounts of money are coming from. Illegally obtained proceeds coming from a myriad of places, and it's very important for these systems to have your placement, layering, integration. The whole point is concealment. I want to make sure that no one can detect that these are ill-gotten gains. We also see that this can include fraud and corruption. Unfortunately, a lot of times what you don't see is that overlapping into fraud and corruption, and with the legislation with terrorism. On the other side of the same coin, we just need to lay out what terrorism is. Terrorism is actually more accurately called political violence, and that's because you have a situation where a group of people are using physical or coercive violence, which means the threat of violence. So you're using physical harm, but the threat of physical harm is just as powerful as the physical aspects of it. And what are you trying to do? You're trying to instill fear. Fear in a population, fear in a government. Why is fear so important? Because you want to fulfill your goals. And those goals, when we talk about terrorism as a definition in terrorist acts, are always political or social political causes. Now, those political aims may change according to the group and what they want, but they're always trying to make a government, an international organization, some authority change their policies and actions. So it's the use of violence to instill fear for a political end to change people's minds. Now, you notice the things I didn't say here in this definition, because there's hundreds of definitions around the world. This really speaks to why is this so difficult to nail down. Well, it's because the aims will change, and and the targets will change. Some organizations will target purely civilians. Some will just go for government members. It really depends, but the methods are going to be similar: fear and violence to affect change. Now, the overlaps here, we have money laundering, which is purely, or I should say there's violence associated with it, but it's a financial process. In terrorism, there's finance too. Nothing happens without money. And so we see some overlaps here. What other overlaps and similarities are we seeing, Andy?
What we've got to remember with money laundering and terrorism is these are both very old problems or very old issues. We've had money laundering, which has always been traditionally the remit of good, honest criminals trying to hide their money from government. Money laundering's been around ever since there's been taxation. And similarly, terrorism in various forms has been around ever since we've had any form of society and political disagreement. So it's an old traditional problem. It's just that we're now seeing huge differences in the modern era and in the information age, which are really driven by globalization and technology.
Technology has been very important in those changes, hasn't it? I mean, we've seen that from the market, and you see financial institutions have been, traditionally embracing technology. It increases efficiency. It moves payments very quickly. But then we also see terrorist groups doing the same thing, not just with finance, but using technology to spread messages, correct?
Yeah, very much so. Globalization has really just changed the way we do our business, and allied with technology, it affects every aspect of society. The phrase that has been coined to encompass this is megatrends, which is where we just see these exponentially greater and greater changes and trends in how we live our lives and do business, and that permeates all levels of society and across the globe. And it's just that the changes and the pace of acceleration in things such as demographic trends, the rapid movement of large numbers of people through air travel, the ability to move around the globe, the mass movement of people, whether it's for economic migration or refugees fleeing conflict zones. They're huge mega trends that we just can't actually control. They're driven by market forces and society and technology. But we have to understand those trends so that we can actually influence them where we can, but also mitigate and benefit from the effects of them. But of course, within that, there are illicit actors also understanding and using those megatrends for their own ends.
Yeah, absolutely. And so those trends are happening, and that's what's also linking all of these problems together. You make it's a real transnational threat as well. So as great as it's been to really expand markets and get people connected, there's also these downsides, so it can be used in many ways. So then let's talk about. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to sort of one of the aspects of that, where to sort of set the scene and to really drill down is when we talk about the globalization and technology piece and the fact there are virtual borders, but actually there are no virtual borders anymore. There are physical borders, but there are no virtual borders where we can move information across jurisdictions in the private sense. But actually, that also means we can move money. People can move money at will across borders. But in the information age, the bit that really is changing is the amount of is data and what is called big data. But the problem that we see is coined as the 4 V's of big data, which is the volume, the variety, the veracity, and the velocity of the data that we face, which in everyday life, but actually is really relevant to the AML/CTF arena. And just to sum that up, we've just got these huge amounts of data in so many different formats with questionable or unknown reliability and moving at almost instantaneous speed. And when you put that into the AML/CTF arena, when you think of it as transactions or data, it's a huge challenge that we have to understand and face and start to take action to mitigate.
And that's really what we're talking about when we were looking at these public-private partnerships. We have massive amounts of data from the private sphere, and then, of course, the public sphere. Governments need that as well. So really combating AML-TTF is a requirement, or I should say needs, both sides here. So we have increasingly, and this was talked to the market versus government view slide here, we have increasingly where you see that private actors are being pulled more deeply into figuring out these networks because they have to be. That's where the data is. And you're talking about this massive data, and that's what's very important is that we need the markets to be involved because they have pieces that everyone needs. So it's really about when we look at this market and government view, whereas they need to work together, there are also different interests into force here. So when we look at money laundering, the market, this is actually easier for the market to determine because you have large scale amounts, massive amounts of transactions. Very big amounts are easier to detect, right? So we're operating in spaces where money launderers will make money, where markets make their money, where financial institutions make their money as well. And because it's so profit-paced, profit-driven, this is a lot easier to detect. But then there's another side of the coin here with governments and money laundering.
Yeah, I mean, from a government perspective, it is very much more concerned with the macroeconomic or the societal effects, where it's really to do with market fairness and understand the geopolitical context, such as identifying countries at risk of instability. And that government concern stretches from everything from, for example, Russian oligarchs or Chinese investment in real estate in London, which skews house prices, which obviously causes concern, but through to the sort of endemic corruption we see in developing nations, which causes capital flight from countries such as the Democratic Republic of Congo or South Sudan, where actually technically they're mineral rich or oil rich and should be able to have a functioning economy. But because of money laundering, because of the bribery and corruption that encourages, it changes the market, it can cause a societal imbalance, and it can just stop the development of a country, causing wider regional instability.
Yeah, absolutely. There is a connection between economic stability and political stability. People need to believe in the system. They need to believe in that fairness and that it works. And then, of course, the markets need to get that money to people who need it for development as well, businesses, public work projects, really anything. So there is a real connection here. And so money laundering can affect all of those things. Contrasting that to terrorist finance, we see some similarities but some real differences here too. So in terms of market actors, financial institutions detecting these, you're looking at much smaller amounts. It's not really it's not profit-based like you're looking at money launderers. It's I need to get this amount of money to a cell, the amount of money to fund fighters. And so there's not a focus on profit. And this might work under the radar. I mean, as markets understand profit, so if they don't see massive amounts going through, it's a little difficult to detect. Their radar isn't really going to be focused on it as much. And then with government, again, we have a contrast in the focus on terrorist finance with the market interest as well.
Yeah, I mean, in contrast to money laundering, there's a much greater time-critical imperative to terrorist financing and the potential that it will lead to a terrorist attack. Money laundering can be a slow burn, it can be a monitor, it can be very much about putting political pressure onto governments and organisations, similar to terrorist financing, but there is always that aspect of even the smallest amount of money that moves that could be linked to a terrorist attack is going to worry the government organisations and security organisations with immediate effect. The duty of the government, its first responsibility is to protect its citizens. and as we've seen in recent attacks in Europe and the US, it can have a disproportionate effect on the political debate in a country, as well as causing terrible loss of life and terrible suffering. So governments are very much focused on the here and now when it comes to terrorist financing.
And I think that what we've laid out here with money laundering, terrorist financing, and at the beginning we talked about there's a difference of interest here. That also means that there's going to be a difference in how the private actors, how financial institutions look at the data and what type of data they're looking at. What we've typically seen is that banks will focus on this on analyzing their data, looking for regulatory risk or market risk, reputational risk. And then, but on the flip side, we see governments focusing on the threat, which really gets to our next slide, which is about what are the characteristics of these financing networks. So how can we bring those two different views, this market view, this market interest, which obviously have an interest in stopping terrorist attacks. I mean, everyone does, but just the nature of the business will make it a little bit more difficult for them to do that, and bring that into understanding the threat. And so that's where we get into how these financing networks work. In order to combat the network, you have to understand the network. You have to imbue the network into your processes and patterns. And that's where we have that bolded. We want people to see there's always a pattern, isn't there?
Yeah, I mean, there's the financial networks are very interesting and fascinating areas, and there's as an intelligence professional, as an intelligence officer, having looked at various problem sets, the key part is to always look for a pattern and look for patterns and anomalies, but always mindful that you may see patterns where actually patterns don't exist, but that's a matter of training experience and conducting your own internal checks. But for instance, something like money laundering, where it's very different from terrorist financing, money laundering tends to be circular. It's rewards-based, it's profits-based, it's about the money. And usually the protagonist, the mastermind behind the predicate crime, which will have generated potentially huge amounts of money. The reason they're doing this is for that money, so they want to see that money come back to them in some form at some stage, but always, and whether it's through obfuscated through front companies, shell companies, laundered through various vehicles, they still want to see that money return to them so that they can use it for their own ends.
So it's always going to come back around. And what about these networks? So what's so important about these networks? I mean, if you're trying to, you're talking about money laundering the circular, you always want to return it, and this is why the networks are so important.
Yeah, I mean, when we talked about the megatrends, one of the issues that there is with globalization is this convergence of the threat, where we see the criminal terrorist nexus, where we see criminal groups who are working for profit and terrorist groups who are working because of ideology, where their interests and their methods converge. They will coalesce as groups. They'll use illicit networks to move for human trafficking, but actually terrorist groups will use that system to move terrorists within that large number of people moving through human trafficking routes, which are specifically for profit. But we see these networks will then actually, when the risk becomes too high, whether it's because of scrutiny, whether there's action against those groups, against those networks, or whether it just becomes unprofitable, then actually those networks will dissipate and disaggregate and go off and do separate actions. But actually those networks never go away. They may be suspended, but there'll always be an understanding that they are there to be used at a later date. It takes real time to establish these sort of transnational routes that are safe and secure for both money launderers and for terrorists. So they're not going to give them up very easily. They may suspend them, but they'll always come back to them at some stage.
So that's the advantage right there. I mean, we're talking about this. There's a commitment to making this work. It's not easy. And if they find trusted individuals, they find trusted networks, they're going to keep going back to them. They might dissipate, as you said, sometimes when perhaps they think that there's a weaker link in the chain or they're being detected, they might hold off on them for a little while. But the fact that these routes are very, very, they're dedicated, whether it be for profit or for terrorism, it's very important. And I think that people need to understand that just like when you think of a business relationship and how important it is to trust the person on the other side of the table, the same is true for these types of networks. They need to operate in secrecy. They need to understand that the people that they're dealing with can be trusted. And that's an advantage here because you can start to see patterns. But at the same time, we have here the influencers. You're always going to have these people who are trusted to facilitate interactions. Can we talk a little about the characters of the individuals that are, I guess, perpetuating these networks?
Yes, the interactions between networks, not just criminal networks, but all networks which are based on human relationships and human factors is really fascinating. It's something that if we understand, we can also have impact on when we understand the nodes and the connectivity between each of those networks. And in this case, what we're talking about here with influencers is really the gatekeepers or the facilitators, the fixers that understand how the informal financial system and the formal financial system work and are able to abuse those systems to move money around. Now, the big takeaway from this, I would say, is that these networks, these illicit networks, operate on trust. It's very much about the influencers trusting the people they do business with, similar to Hawalas, where they understand that the reliability of the people they're dealing with. If you can degrade that trust, you can have impact. There is a direct correlation between trust and the cost of doing business. So two networks that trust each other, the cost of doing business, the ease of doing business, the speed of doing business is quick and easy. Actually, if you can start to impact on those networks and you can get networks doing business with networks that they don't necessarily trust, that there isn't that ability to have confidence in who they're dealing with, the cost of business goes up, and that does affect the way they do their business. It takes away from the profitability and it degrades the amount of money that goes from one area to another. That really does have an effect. And one of the really good examples of that, where we could have impact both as government and market organisations, is the historical artefacts and antiquities smuggling that is happening by ISIS out of Syria and Iraq, where it's difficult to have impact on the actual groups that are on ISIS other than through kinetic means, because they're stuck in Syria and Iraq and it's hard to get to them. But actually, by understanding how they do their business with antiquities smuggling and how they use, how this terrorist group uses organised crime gangs to move those artifacts, to sell them, and then to move the money back in to ISIS, we can have law enforcement and regulatory impact on those crime groups through those third-party countries. So we can have reach into Turkey or Jordan or Lebanon, where we see that sort of money moving and those artifacts, that artifact smuggling occurring.
So the connection, I mean, this is what's really interesting here. So we see these overlaps between these criminal networks and terrorist networks. And what's interesting to me is that the relationship, or the necessity of the relationship of them having to move antiquities through a criminal network is actually a weak point, because so the criminal networks are typically well established and hierarchical. And if you can determine the contact points in those areas for the trafficking of these goods and services, then you can cut off terrorist financing, but then you can also you can affect, I guess, how that they operate, and maybe also get an inside view on how the terrorist finance cells are working, which are actually, in contrast to the organized crime areas, very small. So that to me seems a weak link in the chain, that they've gone out, they've sought these relationships, and that actually has a chance of exposing them.
Yeah, I mean, with this aspect, we're always looking for the individuals, really. I mean, these are networks, but we really do want to get that sort of granularity of intelligence into a network and into these criminal and terrorist groups, where we want to go right down to the individual. A lot of the time it's concentrating on the ideologues and the leaders and the charismatic personalities. But actually, we can also identify and target the facilitators and the financiers, who can tend to be the weak link in the chain, because they are financiers, they have a much more financial outlook. There's the temptation of being around that money and controlling that money, and where we can try to have some sort of influence and impact. It's quite a good example of how the motivation of the financiers differ from the organisations that they represent, or the organisations that they are sitting between. There's a risk aversion, there's a temptation, because there's that proximity to the money. A good example is Abu Akruma al-Anbari, who was an Iraqi responsible for managing ISIS's finances in the Raqqa Governorate, and as the military push into Raqqa Governorate was occurring, his risk calculus was changing, his motivations were changing, and actually he ended up stealing $3 million from the bank he was supposed to be managing on behalf of ISIS, and disappeared off with his family. So that, of course, in itself has some impact on both the ability of ISIS to finance and pay its fighters and to run its so-called caliphate, but also has an effect on morale and the sort of coherence of that terrorist group.
Yeah, so the finances actually, there's, as you said, there's too much temptation. There's a lot of money being passed around. You have people here, there's been studies showing that the terrorist financiers, this is the lowest risk, actually, when you're contrasting it with other individuals in the organization that are doing operations. That terrorist finance has the lowest risk in the operation. So you have maybe people who aren't as committed to it as part of that network. But then also these are people who have heightened relationships in society, and so if they feel that they're going to be exposed by helping an organization, they'll ditch the cause so they can save their reputations as well. Yeah,
there is very much a reputational aspect to the facilitators and influencers themselves, who can mainly be motivated by money. They're sitting between a number of networks, what we call the super fixers and super facilitators, who will operate between a number of crime groups and a number of terrorist groups. They're very much like any institution. They have a reputational risk and a reputation to uphold as well.
And so that's also then gets us to the terrorist finance is usually linear. It's really in one direction. I mean, the financiers are concerned about reputation. They are those links, but they're the link from the donors to the operations. And it just really goes through one node, which is another weakness.
Yeah, I mean, terrorist financing is so much more difficult to track and trace because of the various differences. As we said, it's smaller amounts of money. It tends to be smaller amounts of money. It's linear rather than circular because it's going in one direction, generally to sustain a terrorist cell or for a specific operation such as an attack. It only goes through a node once. if you can identify that node, that's helpful, but actually it makes it so much more difficult because it's not circular. And whereas money laundering tends to come from a predicate crime, where terrorist financing can come from a number of sources, including legitimate sources, whether it's unwitting donors through charities or through, let's say, pseudo-legitimate, where it's come from salaries or loans or student loans, etc., which is used knowingly to be pushed through to a terrorist group, through to criminal enterprises, where terrorist groups actually set up a criminal enterprise in order to raise money.
Mm-hmm. So this has all been, so again, we're mentioning patterns here, and I hope the audience can see this, is that you're looking at predicate crimes, you're seeing different networks of individuals come together, you're seeing that these influences, these facilitators are a lot of the very same people using a lot of the same networks. We see some of the weaknesses in this as well, which is they're less committed. But then we also see in terrorist finances that they're going through nodes only once. And so in some ways you see some overlaps, but there's always a pattern here. And I think that that's very important, is that these are hard-won networks that we can exploit. One, we're looking for how to analyze data. And so let's get to the analysis. So the webinar is about intelligence techniques, but first I think that we have to establish for the audience, and so they can establish it for others, what is intelligence? What can it and can it not do?
Yeah, I think the very important point there, actually, Michelle, is what doesn't intelligence do? A lot of people see intelligence as a catch-all term, as a panacea, and it's misunderstood. So it's worth clarifying that what intelligence can do. It's certainly not a crystal ball, and it doesn't produce predictions. An experienced intelligence professional will not give you a single definitive answer, which is not that's just not what we do. The issue being there is that the circumstances are different in each situation. That may sound like it's a contradiction when we say there's always a pattern, and there is some ambiguity there. But you have to understand that every situation is different, but we have to look for those patterns. What we want to produce is timely and predictive intelligence, which is not a prediction, which allows senior leaders to make decisions, and whether it's specific operational decisions or whether it's setting policy to have that sort of a broader effect.
So it's very important for people to understand what their expectations, what they're getting. We have to set ground rules in saying, okay, we can give you good analysis based on as much data as we have, and it reduces uncertainty. So by understanding these patterns, by focusing your analysis, you can produce better intelligence. You can, as you said, pinpoint a money movement, place someone there. It also gives accountability. It can show you your decision trail. This is why we made these decisions. But it doesn't, as you said, produce predictions. It's not going to predict predictions. It's not going to tell you the future. It's going to produce likelihoods according to these patterns.
Yeah, the outreach aspect and the education is really important here. It's absolutely vital that you reach out to the customers and educate them. That's reaching out upwards to the managers and the C-suite and across all the lines of business and all the lines of defence to manage expectations of what you can do. If you can get some really good granular intelligence, yes, you can ideally pinpoint a money movement, and the ideal situation there is, rather than following the money, by understanding a network, by understanding how it moves its money, where it moves its money, who the players are that are involved in moving that money, rather than following the money, you can actually get ahead of the money, and you can be waiting in a node or seeing the money move as it happens, or be in place before it happens. You're also able, with good intelligence, to place someone or something in time and place. Again, that's really useful for understanding where someone is coming from, what jurisdiction they're operating in, how they're doing their business. But as it gets further up the line, when you're starting to deal with the sort of the policy aspects and decision making, whether it comes to de-risking or debanking an individual entity through to setting policy, it's about reducing uncertainty and understanding the risk and allowing someone with the right decision makers to understand the risk so they can quantify and qualify their own risk and the impact on the business. And then it provides that greater decision support, understanding of the context for the senior operators.
And this is very important because one of the things you hear most often from financial institutions and in private and in conferences is, we're not really sure what authorities want. And so part of the goal of this webinar is to match those market expectations with the authority expectations by focusing on threat. And the process of using intelligence can help you do that. It can meld these two interests that we've been talking together, put them together, so you can look at the data that you have, see the holes, and really produce better reports in understanding the types of scenarios and likelihoods from the viewpoint of the networks that you're actually trying to combat. And so looking forward, let's start applying this. So if we look at the actual intelligence cycle, we see 4 clear steps here, which are great frameworks, and as people will see, are extremely adaptable to really any situation. So the first is you need a clear direction, and that clear direction has to be committed by everyone, correct?
Yeah, I mean, the clear direction piece is obviously the starting point for this. I'll just want to say this is the intelligence cycle, and there's a lot of debate had about the intelligence cycle. It's normally represented as a cycle. It always comes back as a circular action with constant review at all stages. And I've just broken out these. There's a lot of debate about it, sometimes unnecessary, which kind of gets in the way. What I want to do is just break this out into some steps that just to reiterate the fact that this process of direction, collection, processing, and dissemination is just a tool or a technique. It's a handrail that allows, whenever you're going through an intelligence process, it allows you to start the investigation, start the process. But it's also a really good way of, when you're halfway through an investigation and things are getting difficult and lost and you're not quite sure where you are, it's a really good framework that you can come back to. It's a really good framework to wrap around the controls functions and the controls regime at all levels and at all stages of an investigation, and can be done by all units or business units and within all of the 3 lines of defence. So yeah, back to the clear direction of requirements and priorities. This really is because as I said, there's so much data out there. There's so much to process. But actually, FIUs and banks have finite resources. We don't have enough people, and we don't have enough capacity to deal with everything that's thrown at us. So we have to focus on the highest risks. And those risks have to be set and communicated from the highest levels of an organisation. So it's up at the C-suite. Much like the culture of compliance that we talk about, it's got to come from the top down. It's a directed activity, and it has to permeate and be communicated down right to the frontline analysts, and in this context, right into the business units and the first line of defence.
So it's very important here. I always try and show that there are similarities in the public-private side, and I think that this point really speaks to it, is that you hear about budgetary constraints, and spending from both sides. And it's a shared problem. I mean, not everyone has infinite resources to deal with tons of data. So this is a way of having everyone from the top bottom, as you say, commit to a path and support each other on that path, whether it's from the C-suite all the way down to the frontline people that are doing the day-to-day analysis. And that's very important because it's a team-like atmosphere. It's not always directed from the top down. There's two ways to this, right? I mean, everyone has to have the buy-in, but the direction has to be set from the top.
Yeah, I mean, you need that clear direction so that you can tailor your collection activity to collect the data that is necessary. There's so much of it out there that you have to be absolutely crystal clear on what your priorities are, what the requirement is against the risk and the threat, so that you can actually tailor your activity to ensure that you get the most efficient use of your resources.
So then that will flow into the second point, which is that now that you've set your direction and you've understood what you should be collecting, you have to focus on what's required. So you have to look at, I guess you should say, you have to look at what type of data you should be collecting. So, and what I like about this is that this is not what's easiest or most comfortable. It's what's necessary. Focus on what's required. So how do we do that?
We go back to the 4 V's that I spoke about with data and big data. And I think there's that temptation to see big data as the panacea or the solution to all our problems is, let's collect all the data, let's try to get it structured and then run algorithms over it using machine learning and artificial intelligence and all those really quite smart technical solutions. But actually that doesn't necessarily mean that you've focused on what is the greatest risk to you if that direction hasn't been clear. The collection aspect is there's so much data there that from open source, from the databases within the bank, from customer due diligence, from customer onboarding, from social media, all these other aspects. But we have to try and really narrow that down if we are to be able to get the right data into the right format so that we can then apply some analysis to it. The technical aspect, but there's also the critical thinking aspect of how are we applying the best techniques? What are we looking at? Where are our intelligence start points?
And so financial institutions are already halfway there. I mean, what we're saying is we know that they already have risk matrices based on their line of businesses and product support. And what they also need to do is match these to patterns of financial crime. And then that will also help them target those resources. So the data collection is already according to market interest. And it really needs also to be then tailored to the threat as well. And then this will determine your risks.
Yeah, there's plenty of risk identification and risk matrices techniques out there. And obviously banks are very used to dealing with risk in that financial risk sense of liquidity and understanding where their exposure is. And in some ways, it's moving that understanding of risk from financial risk into operational or financial crime risk and across all the lines of business.
And understanding and training your people to know how to analyze that data together. So the training, there's an investment here, but it's a good investment for analysts. It's important.
Yeah, I mean, training is something that actually cuts across all aspects of the intelligence cycle, across all aspects of financial crime, of course. But it really, I think the weakest area it is in collection and analysis, in that there isn't necessarily that professionalization of the financial crime analyst, the ability to, or the training that's given to them to allow them to think critically and apply critical thinking to these financial crime and terrorist financing problems. From what I've seen, the analysts are very smart people. They're very motivated. Their aptitude is absolutely key in all of this, aptitude and curiosity and the desire to get into data and understand the trends and the patterns. But actually, there's also a key training issue for the professionalization of the AML CTF analysts. And everyone's got a part to play in this, whether it's government who have access to an understanding of different training techniques, the financial institutions who also have their own training and the greater understanding of the financial community, and also the professional bodies, the certification accreditation bodies have their part to play in this as well.
And so it's very important because we have, if you don't do first steps 1 and 2, you get weak collection, you get weak analysis. You need to be able to train people to understand what they're doing, and that's because there's always uncertainty. We've used that word several times in the webinar, uncertainty. And I'd like you to talk a little bit about the structured analytical techniques and how. So how do we apply that? What are the types of techniques that we're going to use to reduce uncertainty?
Yeah, so as you say, weak collection equals weak analysis. If we haven't got the direction and we haven't got the collection right, it's going to be very difficult to have accurate and impactful analysis. But supposing that we do, and hopefully we do, and I think in most cases we probably do, we still have to apply critical thinking to that data. There is the ability to run very complex programs and algorithms over the data, but we really do have to ensure that we still have that human factor, that human thinking, and the understanding of that behind all of this there are people, human beings, who are part of these networks that are facilitating this, and apply our own critical thinking there. The structured analytical techniques, just a bit of history really on that, is it really came out of post 9/11 and the Iraq WMD intelligence failures. There's no other sort of phrase for it, where the various intelligence communities and law enforcement communities made that push to actually have mandated training that looks at that has better standardization and professionalization of intelligence analysis. And just to define SATs, as they call it, just a variety of techniques, and there are a number of them that promote critical thinking. They're systematic, they're transparent, they're step-by-step processes, and there's a way of externalizing an analyst's thinking, and it reduces potential errors by identifying and mitigating cognitive biases that everyone has, and it provides an audit trail of and the working out of how you got to the answer, so that should you need to, you can always go back to it. If you identify an error, you can always get back to the point before the error and carry on with the analysis. There's a lot of structured analytical techniques, but just to give you some examples, I think would be things like structured brainstorming, alternate competing hypotheses, red teaming, and timelines and chronologies. And effectively, I've kind of picked my 4 favourite techniques really for SATs, and I'll go through them just very briefly. So something like structured brainstorming, it's a really good technique at the start of an investigation in this context, where you're able to generate new ideas by getting subject matter experts and importantly non-subject matter experts at the start of a project, and it just generates new ideas. It mitigates against biases such as groupthink and confirmation bias, and it's also a good technique to bring in halfway or 3/4 of the way through an investigation where the thinking has stalled, it's become a bit stale. It's a really good way of reinvigorating an investigation. Something like alternate competing hypotheses is a good technique where you're able to generate multiple alternatives where the situation is really complex and really fluid and difficult to understand. And it's about ordering the likelihood of these hypotheses and attributing probability to those hypotheses. You may discard some, but they're always on the shelf to come back to as new information becomes available. Another one that I think a lot of people will probably have heard of is red teaming or red hat thinking, which is where the analysts and the analytical teams are forced to think like the adversary, like the terrorist networks, like the organised crime networks, like the financiers who facilitate that movement of money. And it really is about genuinely thinking like your adversary. Very difficult to do because most of us are not terrorists or organised crime financiers, but it allows you to really generate very different assessments. It allows for imaginative thinking. It guards against mirror imaging and our own cultural biases that we may have. And my final sort of the favourite one is things like timelines and chronologies, which is a really good way of ordering events and activities, which is a really good way of mitigating against deception and denial of information. It lays out a very clear pathway of what's happened, of the processes that occurred. And when you bring all four of those techniques and various other techniques together, it can be quite a powerful tool for producing robust, transparent analysis that can lead to much more effective, insightful assessments, but also giving you an understanding of the confidence levels you have in that assessment, the probabilities of your predictive analysis. And all these techniques really that I really am advocating for is you're conducting this gap analysis and ordering and analysing data, coming up with these imaginative, plausible potential explanations and scenarios. They're very much tools. They're scalable. They can be scaled up or scaled down. They can be used by any of the business units or any of the three lines of defence within their own areas. And they can be standardised and shared across all of those units so that actually the work is only done once. But also noting that actually with all this, you really do want that feedback and that dialogue to keep updating and keep those assessments fresh.
So it seems so structured analytical techniques are definitely ways for, in some situations, to put yourself in the adversary's shoes. Think about how you would do it. Thinking about analyzing that data and patterns. We only have a few minutes, and we have a few questions that I would like to get to as well. So I want to quickly go through the next part, which is dissemination. This is very important because after you've gone through the analysis of this data, you've got your direction, you are then analyzing what you're looking at with what you have, there comes a decision that I know is very difficult for many financial institutions is when do you share it? When do you file a SAR? When do you protect that data? And this is very important because what a lot of people don't realize it without us saying it is that in data protection, it's about purpose limitation. So by going through the intelligence cycle and having a very clear focused direction, you're not just protecting the data in terms of data protection and privacy, which is very important, especially for people that work in the EU, because the fourth anti-money laundering directive is put it in there. But then it also is protecting things like confidentiality. You're only sharing what you have to share at the end and what you should share at the end.
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously the two very different perspectives on data sharing and whether it's between two private commercial institutions or banks, or between governments, or between the public and private sector. One of the comments really is that there are very different perspectives on this, with very different access to pools of information. Obviously, where you've got commercial institutions have access to customer data and open source, whereas government institutions potentially have access to classified secret intelligence they can't share. But actually, where the difference also is on actually a viewpoint on what a SAR is and what it does. The two, there are very different viewpoints on what it achieves and what it is and what it's there for, and that does affect the thinking behind how to share and when to share, that decision making on when it becomes proportionate and necessary to share data. Allied with the added complication, of course, that when it comes to cross-jurisdictional sharing, there are very complicated laws, regulations, and protocols to follow.
Which are important, and they protect, as you said, the individuals, also protect financial institutions, and then they also get better data in the end. So this public-private feedback, I mean, what we're really talking about here, too, is having financial institutions understand the challenges that authorities have, and then also bringing in some of those techniques that authorities have into the financial institution realm. And this is all part of that feedback loop as well.
Yeah, I mean, the feedback is so important, of course, in all of this, in that it is a way of getting that information out there, but also it encourages the sharing of information. And not everyone has all of the data. Not everyone has the whole picture all of the time. So when you get that feedback, there is, whether it's just a different way of looking at a problem, but actually it also can uncover vital bits of data, vital information, vital intelligence that will add to the analysis of the threat.
So I put up our key takeaway slides, which is in our, I guess, our theme, which is don't follow the money, get ahead of the money. Understanding the patterns and being able to do analysis is very important. The intelligence cycle is a very adaptable way of doing this. We have a few questions, and we have probably like 2 minutes left, but I want to at least get to one of them because I feel that it speaks to our points. So we had 2 questions. One person asked the highest risk that they should focus on should be those found after the risk-based approach has been conducted. And then another connected to that question was, what key data do we need to look at to catch the threat? I think the answer to this question is, or both of these questions are connected. One, banks are already doing the risk-based assessment, as we said. You're doing it according to regulatory threat, reputational risk, your lines of business. I know, as we understand, that those processes exist. What we're asking is that you also look at these patterns and understand how these networks work, and then juxtapose and include those in the intelligence gathering. So what types of data, like where would they find evidence of these patterns? I mean, you can find them in open sources, I understand, and as I've seen, there's lots of studies in open source, but then there's also that public-private feedback we talked about.
Yeah, I mean, the repositories of data are vast, and whether it's internal to the banks or whether it's classified or whether it's the open source intelligence, don't get hung up on the fact that there is a lot of data out there. That's just something we have to accept, and for these aspects of big data. Where I'm coming from with this intelligence aspect is that it's not prescriptive, it's not dogma, it's a framework, and there are tools in the toolbox that allow you to have a handrail and a framework that you can wrap around your controls regime. And it's flexible. It's tools and techniques that you can expand or contract for a particular problem. So you have to look at them as generic tools, as generic frameworks, and then tailor them to the situation that you're in, whatever the data is that you've got, and whatever the product that you're trying to produce, and whoever the customer is. All these techniques are generic and adaptable, and are just tools to be used by analysts and institutions to get the outputs and the outcomes that they want.
Okay. Well, I think that we're out of time. I would like to thank everyone for their attendance. I wish we could have gotten to more questions, but I hope that this has been very helpful. Andy, thank you so much for your insights and your time. And I wish everyone a good day.
Yeah, thank you, Michelle, and thanks to all who've dialed in. And I hope it was useful and interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.